My neighbor tried to impound my dog because he barks too much, and now no one thinks I deserve him. I knew my life was falling apart when Mrs. Patterson crossed the street to avoid me. She'd been walking her poodle toward my house like she had every morning for 3 years, but the moment she spotted me watering my garden, she yanked Duchess's leash and practically sprinted to the other sidewalk. The look she shot me wasn't confusion or awkwardness. It was pure disgust. That's when I realized the whispers had reached everyone. "You need to do something about those dogs," my next-door neighbor Bryce had said 2 days earlier, standing at my fence with his arms crossed. "People are talking." I'd laughed it off then. My 2 golden retrievers, Copper and Benny, were the sweetest dogs on the block. Everyone knew that. Copper would roll over for belly rubs from strangers, and Benny once refused to come inside during a thunderstorm because he was too busy comforting a scared cat under my porch. But now Mrs. Patterson was treating me like I tortured puppies for fun. My phone buzzed with a text from my friend Rachel. "Hey, can we rain check coffee this week? Something came up." That made 3 canceled plans in 2 days. I dropped my watering can and pulled out my phone, scrolling through the neighborhood Facebook group I'd barely paid attention to before. My stomach twisted as I found the thread buried under posts about lost cats and garage sales. "Has anyone else noticed concerning sounds coming from the house on Maple Street?" Posted by someone named Jennifer Kemp. "My friend lives nearby and says there's been a lot of barking and crying from those poor dogs. Just wondering if anyone else has seen anything." 17 comments. 17 people discussing my dogs like I was running some kind of underground fighting ring. I've always thought something was off about that person. Dogs don't cry like that unless something's wrong. Should we call animal control? Those dogs deserve better. I feel so bad for them. You can tell they're scared when you walk by. My hands shook as I read comment after comment from neighbors I'd waved to for years. People who'd never set foot on my property, who'd never met Copper and Benny, were suddenly experts on my pet care. The worst part? Half these people didn't even know my name. They kept referring to that person on Maple Street like I was some anonymous villain. I locked my phone and walked to my backyard, where Copper was chasing a butterfly and Benny was napping in his favorite sunny spot. They looked up at me with those goofy golden retriever grins, tails wagging. "What's happening?" I asked them. Copper tilted his head like he was genuinely trying to solve my problem. That evening, I decided to take both dogs for a walk around the neighborhood. Maybe if people saw how happy and healthy they were, this ridiculous rumor would die out naturally. We'd done this walk hundreds of times before. Copper always stopped to say hello to the Miller family's cat, and Benny had a favorite tree he liked to sniff for exactly 30 seconds. But tonight felt different. The Millers were in their front yard, and I raised my hand to wave. Mr. Miller looked right through me and herded his wife toward their front door. She glanced back once with this expression I'd never seen before, like she was watching a car accident. 3 houses down, a woman I didn't recognize was walking her small terrier. When she spotted us, she immediately pulled out her phone. I thought she might be texting, but she held it up like she was recording. "Excuse me," I called out, picking up my pace. "Are you filming my dogs?" She didn't answer, just turned and walked quickly in the other direction, still holding her phone. By the time we got home, I felt like I'd been paraded through town as some kind of criminal. Copper and Benny were oblivious, happy from their adventure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was watching us. I checked the Facebook group again before bed. The thread had grown to 23 comments, and someone had posted a blurry photo of me walking the dogs. "Took this tonight. Look how scared those poor animals look." I stared at the photo. Copper was mid-pant from the walk, tongue hanging out, and Benny was looking up at me with his usual adoring expression. To me, they looked like 2 content, well-loved dogs, but apparently the internet saw something completely different. The comments under the photo made my chest tight. "This is heartbreaking. Those dogs are clearly in distress. How is this person still allowed to have pets? Someone needs to report this. This is animal abuse." I'd gone to bed worried about a silly neighborhood misunderstanding. I woke up branded as an animal abuser by people who'd never spoken a word to me. My phone had 6 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize. When I called back, a woman identified herself as Officer Cooper from Animal Control. "We've received several reports about possible neglect or abuse of dogs at your address," she said in that carefully neutral tone government employees use. "We'll need to schedule a visit for an inspection." "There's been a mistake," I said, my voice cracking. "My dogs are fine. This is all based on some Facebook rumors." "I understand this must be stressful," Officer Cooper replied, "but we have to follow up on all reports. Can you be available Thursday afternoon?" After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at Copper and Benny eating their breakfast. Their tails wagged when they saw me watching. Benny brought me his favorite tennis ball, dropping it at my feet like he did every morning. These were the dogs people thought I was abusing. I'd lived in this neighborhood for 5 years. I'd helped Mrs. Patterson carry groceries when her hip was bad. I'd watched the Andersons' house when they went on vacation. I donated to every school fundraiser and attended every block party. But somehow in less than a week, I'd become the neighborhood monster. The notification sound from my phone made me jump. Another Facebook message, this time in a private group chat I'd been added to without my knowledge. "Neighborhood safety alert. Maple Street situation," the group was called. 47 members. 47 neighbors discussing me like I was a dangerous criminal they needed to monitor. I closed Facebook and put my phone in a drawer, but the damage was already spreading and I had no idea how to stop it. All I knew was that someone had decided to destroy my life, and they were doing a perfect job. 3 months earlier, this neighborhood felt like home. I'd moved to Maple Street after my divorce, looking for a fresh start somewhere quiet. The house was nothing special, a small ranch with a fenced backyard perfect for dogs, but the neighbors made it feel welcoming from day one. Mrs. Patterson brought over homemade cookies and stayed for an hour telling me about every family on the block. The Andersons next door offered to help me move furniture. Even Bryce, who lived in the big colonial across the street, stopped by to introduce himself and complain about how the previous owner never maintained the lawn. "You seem like someone who actually cares about property values," he'd said, shaking my hand with that firm grip politicians use. I should have paid more attention to that comment. Within a week of moving in, I'd adopted Copper and Benny from the local shelter, 2 golden retrievers, brothers who'd been surrendered together when their elderly owner passed away. The shelter volunteer said they were inseparable, and I couldn't bear to split them up. The neighborhood fell in love with them immediately. Mrs. Patterson always carried dog treats in her purse, and Copper learned to sit pretty whenever he saw her coming. The Anderson kids would run to the fence every afternoon, begging to pet the fluffy boys. Even the mailman, who usually avoided dogs, started bringing them special biscuits. "Those are the happiest dogs I've ever seen," my mail carrier told me one day, scratching Benny behind the ears. "You can tell they're well cared for." I thought I'd found my perfect little community. The first block party that summer sealed it for me. Everyone contributed something. Mrs. Patterson's famous potato salad, the Andersons' homemade ice cream, elaborate barbecue spreads from families whose names I was still learning. I brought a chocolate cake and felt genuinely grateful to be included. Copper and Benny were the stars of the party. Kids surrounded them all afternoon, and both dogs soaked up the attention like furry celebrities. I must have taken 50 photos of neighbors posing with my boys. "They're like therapy dogs," laughed Rebecca from 2 houses down, as Benny rolled over for belly rubs from her toddler. So gentle with kids. That night, I remember thinking I'd finally found where I belonged. After years of marriage to someone who criticized everything I did, living somewhere people actually liked me felt revolutionary. But there was one person who didn't join the celebration. Bryce stood in his front yard most of the afternoon, arms crossed, watching the party like he was monitoring a potential riot. When I waved him over, he just nodded and stayed put. Later, Mrs. Patterson mentioned that he'd complained to her about the noise. "Some people don't like fun," she'd whispered, rolling her eyes. I didn't think much of it then. Every neighborhood has that one person who doesn't socialize. Bryce kept his lawn immaculate and his house painted perfectly, so I figured he was just particular about his space. The problem started small. A few weeks after the block party, I found a typed note tucked under my windshield wiper. "Please be more mindful of your dogs barking early in the morning. Some of us have to work." No signature. I walked around to all my immediate neighbors, apologizing and asking if my dogs had been too noisy. Mrs. Patterson looked confused. The Andersons said they'd never heard excessive barking. 3 other families assured me the dogs weren't a problem. "Honestly, we barely know they're there unless we see them playing in your yard," said Mrs. Chen from across the street. "They're quieter than most dogs." But the notes kept coming. "Always typed, never signed, always left on my car. Your dogs seem agitated lately. Perhaps they need more exercise or attention. Other residents have mentioned concerns about animal sounds from your property. The constant barking is affecting property values. Please address this immediately." Each note made me second-guess myself. I started keeping a log of when Copper and Benny barked, trying to identify patterns or problems. Most days, they barely made noise except for the occasional excitement when a squirrel invaded the yard. I bought them new toys, adjusted their feeding schedule, even hired a dog walker for midday visits when I was at work. Nothing changed the notes. The neighborhood dynamics shifted so gradually, I almost didn't notice. People still smiled and waved, but conversations felt shorter. Mrs. Patterson stopped lingering for our usual 10-minute chats when she walked Duchess. The Anderson kids still played with the dogs through the fence, but their parents started calling them inside faster. At the second block party in late summer, I noticed people positioning themselves differently. Instead of everyone mingling freely, there seemed to be invisible boundaries. Families clustered with families they already knew well, and I found myself standing alone more often. Copper and Benny still drew attention from the kids, but some parents hovered closer than before, like they needed to supervise interactions that had been perfectly natural just months earlier. "Everything okay?" I asked Rebecca when I saw her watching her toddler play with Benny like she was expecting something to go wrong. "Oh, sure," she said, but she didn't elaborate. That night, cleaning up after the party, I found another note on my car. "Interesting how much attention you seek with those dogs. Some of us see what's really happening." I crumpled it up and threw it in my kitchen trash, but the word stuck with me. What was really happening? My dogs were happy and healthy. I was a good neighbor who contributed to community events and helped when people needed it. But someone clearly saw something different. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in September. I was running late for work and rushed outside to find Copper appearing unwell in the yard. Not unusual. He'd gotten into something the night before, probably a dead bug or some grass. But as I was cleaning up, I noticed Bryce standing at his window watching. When I looked up and waved, he didn't wave back. He pulled out his phone. 20 minutes later, while I was getting Copper cleaned up and checking if he needed to see the vet, Mrs. Patterson knocked on my door. "Honey, I just wanted to check on you," she said, but her voice sounded different. "Careful. Bryce mentioned he saw one of your dogs looking sick this morning." "Copper ate something weird yesterday," I explained. "He's fine now, just an upset stomach." Mrs. Patterson nodded, but she kept glancing toward my backyard. "And they're eating okay? Getting enough water?" "Of course they are." I felt heat rising in my cheeks. "Mrs. Patterson, is there something you're trying to ask me?" No, she said quickly. Well, people talk, you know? And with all the concerns lately." "What concerns?" She looked uncomfortable. "Maybe you should talk to Bryce. He seems to know more about what's been going on." After she left, I marched across the street and rang Bryce's doorbell. He answered like he'd been waiting for me. "We need to talk," I said. "Yes," he agreed. "We do." Bryce's living room looked like a furniture showroom. Everything perfectly arranged, not a speck of dust anywhere. Family photos positioned at exact angles. He gestured for me to sit on a white couch that probably cost more than my car. "I've been trying to handle this delicately," he said, settling into the chair across from me. "But clearly, subtlety isn't working." "Handle what exactly?" He leaned forward with that concerned expression people use when they're about to ruin your day. "Your dogs are suffering. Everyone can see it except you." "That's ridiculous. My dogs are fine." "Are they?" Bryce pulled out his phone and started scrolling. "I've been documenting incidents for weeks. Would you like to see?" My stomach dropped. "Documenting what incidents?" He turned his phone toward me. A video of Copper in my backyard panting heavily after chasing a ball. Another clip of both dogs drinking from their water bowl. "Look at how they're behaving," Bryce said. "This one shows concerning patterns." I stared at him. "Those are normal dog behaviors." Copper was playing fetch. Dogs pant when they exercise. They drink water when they're thirsty. "That's not what I see." His voice had that patient tone adults use with children. "I see animals in distress." "You've been filming my dogs without permission?" "I've been documenting concerning behavior visible from public areas," he corrected. "Someone needs to advocate for those animals." The way he said someone made it clear he saw himself as their savior and me as their captor. "Bryce, this is insane. Ask anyone who knows Copper and Benny. They're happy, healthy dogs." "I have asked people." He set his phone phone down carefully. Mrs. Patterson is concerned. The Andersons have noticed changes in their behavior. Even your mail carrier mentioned something to me about problems. Each name hit like a slap. These were people I trusted. People who'd seemed genuinely fond of my dogs just weeks earlier. When did you talk to them? When neighbors are worried about animal welfare, they reach out. Bryce's tone suggested this was perfectly normal. I've become something of a liaison for concerned residents. A liaison for what? For addressing the situation before it requires official intervention. I felt like I was in some alternate reality where caring for pets made you a criminal. What official intervention? Well, that depends on you. Bryce stood up and walked to his window, looking out at my house. If you're willing to work with us on a solution, maybe we can resolve this privately. What kind of solution? He turned back to me with what I'm sure he thought was a reasonable expression. Find better homes for the dogs. Somewhere with more space, people with more experience handling animals with behavioral issues. My dogs don't have behavioral issues. The concerning patterns, the visible distress. There are no concerning patterns. My voice cracked with frustration. You're making this up. Bryce's expression shifted to something colder. I have video evidence. I have witness statements. I have documentation going back months. Documentation of what? Dogs being dogs? Documentation of a pattern of neglect that's escalating. He said it so matter-of-factly, like we were discussing weather patterns instead of accusations that could destroy my life. This is harassment, I said, standing up. You're harassing me. I'm protecting animals who can't protect themselves. Bryce walked to his front door and opened it. But if you're not willing to address this voluntarily, other people will have to get involved. I left his house shaking with anger and confusion. Everything he'd said was twisted, but he'd said it with such confidence. And if he'd really talked to my neighbors, if people I trusted were expressing concerns, maybe I was missing something. That night, I called my sister in California. He's gaslighting you, she said immediately after I explained the situation. This guy sounds like a control freak who's decided you don't belong in his perfect neighborhood. But what if he's right? What if I'm not seeing something wrong with the dogs? Are they eating? Yes. Playing? Yes. Happy to see you when you come home? Of course. Then this guy can shove his concerns where the sun doesn't shine. I laughed for the first time in weeks. But after we hung up, the doubt crept back in. My sister lived 3,000 miles away. She hadn't seen my dogs recently. What if there was something I was missing? The next morning brought a new escalation. I found a flyer tucked under my windshield wiper. Neighborhood watch meeting. Tonight 7 p.m. Community Center. Agenda. Addressing animal welfare concerns on Maple Street. My address was printed at the bottom. They were holding a meeting about my dogs. An official neighborhood meeting. I spent the day alternating between fury and panic. Should I go and defend myself? Should I ignore it and hope it would blow over? Should I call a lawyer? By 6:30, I decided I had to attend. If people were making decisions about my life, I needed to be in the room. The community center was fuller than I'd ever seen it. At least 30 people, including faces I recognized from block parties and dog walks. Mrs. Patterson sat in the front row, avoiding eye contact. The Andersons were there with their kids. Even families from streets I'd never visited had shown up. Bryce stood at the front like he was running for mayor. Thank you all for coming, he began. We're here because multiple residents have expressed concerns about animal welfare in our neighborhood. He gestured toward a presentation screen that showed a map of our area with my house marked in red. Over the past several months, I've received numerous reports of concerning incidents from this address. He clicked to a slide titled Documented Concerns. He didn't show specific details, but painted a picture of ongoing problems that made my blood run cold. Each vague reference was a distortion of normal events, but presented on an official-looking slide in front of 30 neighbors, it looked damning. I've tried to address this privately, Bryce continued, but the situation appears to be escalating. We have a responsibility to protect animals in our community. An older man I didn't recognize raised his hand. Have authorities been contacted? Animal control is scheduled to inspect the property this week, Bryce replied. But as a community, we can provide additional support to ensure proper care standards are met. That was news to me. Bryce somehow knew about the animal control visit before I'd even scheduled it. Mrs. Patterson finally looked at me, her expression torn between guilt and concern. Maybe we could help with dog walking or pet sitting. Sometimes people just need support. That's generous, Margaret, Bryce said smoothly. But this situation requires more structured intervention. He clicked to another slide. Proposed community action plan. The general framework made my vision blur. Daily check-ins, mandatory training classes, regular inspections, temporary placement options during an education period. They were planning to take my dogs away from me. This is insane, I said, standing up. My voice echoed in the suddenly quiet room. You're talking about my pets like I'm some kind of criminal. No one is attacking you personally, Bryce replied in that maddeningly calm voice. We're concerned about animal welfare. Based on what? Dogs drinking water? Dogs playing in their own yard? Based on documented patterns of concerning behavior. Lies. The word came out louder than I intended. These are lies, and everyone in this room knows it. I looked around at faces I'd shared barbecues with, people who'd pet my dogs and told me how well behaved they were. Now they stared at me like I was having a breakdown. Mrs. Patterson, you've known Copper and Benny for months. Have you ever seen them mistreated? She looked uncomfortable. Well, no, but what? Sometimes it's hard to see problems when you're close to a situation, Bryce interjected. That's why community oversight is important. Community oversight? I felt like I was losing my mind. You people are talking about stalking me. We're talking about protecting animals, said a woman I'd never met. If there's nothing wrong, you shouldn't object to oversight. The circular logic was suffocating. If I agreed to their monitoring, it meant I was admitting guilt. If I refused, it proved I had something to hide. I'm not agreeing to any of this, I said. You people need to mind your own business. The room erupted in uncomfortable murmurs. Someone near the back said, "See? She's being defensive." Another voice. If she's got nothing to hide? I gathered my purse and walked toward the exit, but Bryce's voice followed me. The animal control inspection is scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m. I'll be there as a community representative to ensure thoroughness. I turned back. You'll be there? As an advocate for the animals. As my neighbor who's been harassing me for months. As someone who cares about animal welfare more than personal feelings. Every eye in the room was on me, and I could see the judgment forming. The crazy dog lady who couldn't handle criticism. The defensive pet owner who put her comfort above animal safety. I left without another word. word. Outside in my car, I sat in the parking lot and watched people file out of the meeting. They clustered in small groups, talking in low voices and glancing toward my car, planning their next moves. Mrs. Patterson approached my passenger window and tapped gently. I rolled it down. "Honey," she said, "maybe you should consider what they're saying. Sometimes we can't see our own blind spots." "Mrs. Patterson, you've been in my backyard. You've seen how I care for those dogs." "I know you love them," she said carefully, "but love isn't always enough." She walked away, and I realized that even the people who should have been my allies had been turned against me. Bryce had spent months building a case that painted my normal pet ownership as abuse. He'd documented ordinary dog behavior as evidence of neglect. He'd convinced an entire neighborhood that I was a threat to animals who adored me. And on Thursday, he'd be standing next to the animal control officer, pointing out every piece of evidence he'd collected. I drove home to find another note on my windshield. Last chance to do the right thing voluntarily. Inside, Copper and Benny greeted me like I'd been gone for years instead of 2 hours. They had no idea their entire world was about to be turned upside down by a man who'd never spoken a single word to them. That's when I decided to fight back. The first thing I did was install a security camera. I'd never needed one before. Our neighborhood was safe, and I trusted my neighbors. But if Bryce was filming my dogs and twisting normal behavior into evidence of abuse, I needed my own documentation. The camera arrived Wednesday morning, one day before the animal control inspection. I positioned it to cover my backyard where it could document normal activity. If he was going to keep watching my dogs, I'd be watching right back. The second thing I did was call my veterinarian. "Dr. Patel, I need a favor," I said when she answered. "Can you do a complete health assessment on both my dogs today? I need official documentation of their condition. Is everything all right?" I explained the situation as calmly as possible. Dr. Patel had been treating Copper and Benny since I adopted them, and she knew them well. "That's absolutely ridiculous," she said immediately. "Those dogs are two of the healthiest, happiest animals I've ever treated. Bring them in at 3. 2 hours later, I had official veterinary records documenting that both dogs were in excellent health, properly vaccinated, and showed no signs of neglect, abuse, or distress. Dr. Patel even noted their ideal body weight and excellent dental condition. "If anyone questions your pet care," she told me, "have them call me directly. I'll be happy to explain what actual animal abuse looks like, and this isn't it." Armed with professional documentation, I spent Wednesday evening reviewing everything that had happened. I made a timeline of events, starting with the first anonymous note and ending with the community meeting. That's when I noticed the pattern. Every escalation had happened after I'd done something social in the neighborhood. The first note appeared after the block party where Copper and Benny were the center of attention. The concerns started after the second block party where kids spent hours playing with my dogs. Bryce hadn't developed animal welfare concerns. He'd developed jealousy. Thursday morning at 8 a.m., my new security camera caught something interesting. I was getting ready for work when I got a motion alert on my phone. The video showed Bryce walking along the property line between our houses. He glanced around, then tossed something over my fence into the backyard. I ran outside to see what he'd thrown. Lying in my yard was a raggedy toy, the kind of cheap, unsafe item that responsible pet owners avoid. It looked old and unsanitary. But here's the weird part. There was a piece of tape on it with my name written in block letters. I left the item exactly where it had landed and went back inside to save the security footage. Bryce had just planted evidence in my yard. But why? The answer came 3 hours later when Officer Cooper from Animal Control arrived for the inspection. "We've received reports that you're not providing appropriate toys and enrichment for your animals," she said, reading from her clipboard. "Neighbors have expressed concern about inadequate care." "Actually, let me show you something first," I said, leading her to my backyard. The planted item was still lying in the grass. Officer Cooper frowned when she saw it. "This is exactly the kind of unsafe item we see in neglect cases," she said. "Choking hazards, unsanitary conditions." "I agree completely," I interrupted. "That's why I've never bought anything like that for my dogs. Someone threw it into my yard this morning." I showed her the security footage on my phone. Her expression changed as she watched Bryce plant the evidence. "Well, that's interesting," she said quietly. The rest of the inspection went smoothly. Officer Cooper examined both dogs, reviewed their veterinary records, checked their food and water setup, and inspected their living conditions. She spent almost an hour being thorough. "These animals are clearly well cared for," she concluded. "Excellent body condition, proper vaccination records, clean living environment, appropriate food and water access. I see no evidence of neglect or abuse." "What about the reports you received?" "Between you and me, we get a lot of calls from neighbors with personal disputes. Real animal abuse looks very different from this." She gestured around my yard where Copper and Benny were playing with their actual toys. "Your dogs are obviously loved." Just as Officer Cooper was packing up, Bryce appeared at my fence. "How did the inspection go?" he asked, like he'd been timing his arrival. "The animals are fine," Officer Cooper replied. "No evidence of neglect or abuse." Bryce's confident expression faltered. "Did you see the unsafe toys? The inadequate care conditions?" "I saw planted evidence," Officer Cooper said coolly. "And I have video footage of who planted it." The color drained from Bryce's face. "I don't know what you're talking about. The item with the owner's name taped to it? The one you threw into this yard this morning while you thought no one was watching?" "That's impossible. I was at work this morning." Officer Cooper looked at her watch. "At 8 a.m. on a Thursday?" Bryce opened his mouth, then closed it again. He'd just lied to a government official, and we all knew it. "Mr. Whitman," Officer Cooper continued, "filing false reports and fabricating support can carry legal consequences. I was trying to help those animals. You were trying to cause problems for your neighbor. There's a significant difference." After Officer Cooper left, I sat in my kitchen feeling vindicated but exhausted. I had proof that Bryce had filed false reports and planted evidence. I had veterinary records showing my dogs were healthy. I had security footage of his harassment. But I also knew this wasn't over. Bryce had spent months building his case against me. He wasn't going to give up just because one inspection didn't go his way. That evening, I got the break I'd been hoping for. A large manila envelope appeared in my mailbox with no return address. Inside were photocopies of what looked like official documents, incident reports, neighborhood complaints, and something that made my blood run cold. At the top of the stack was a letter letter addressed to the City Planning Commission with a disturbing proposal to create a neighborhood program that would give him power to remove pets from people's homes. The letter was signed by Bryce Whitman and dated 2 weeks ago. I read through it twice before the implications sank in. Bryce wasn't just trying to get my dogs taken away. He was trying to establish himself as some kind of neighborhood animal control authority, with legal backing from the city. The letter outlined vague concerns about multiple properties in the area and requested permission to create a volunteer program that could intervene in animal welfare situations before they require official action. But here's what made it evidence of fraud. The letter claimed to have unanimous neighborhood support and included a petition with 37 signatures. I recognized most of the names: Mrs. Patterson, the Andersons, families from streets I'd never visited. But looking closely, it was obvious many of the signatures were written in nearly identical handwriting. Bryce had clearly forged most of the signatures on his petition, but the smoking gun was at the bottom of the stack, a draft email that had somehow been printed and included with the other documents. The email revealed that he'd called me a target, admitted to building a false case, and revealed that this was all about establishing himself as some kind of unofficial authority figure in the neighborhood. But the most damning line was about resolving my case first. That proved this was never about animal welfare. It was about proving he could destroy someone's life and get away with it. The question was, who had sent me these documents? I examined the envelope more carefully. The postmark was local, dated yesterday. No return address, but there was a small coffee stain in the corner that looked deliberate. Then I noticed something else. The letter to the City Planning Commission had a header showing it had been printed from a computer at Riverside Public Library, Computer Station 7. Someone had intercepted Bryce's documents at the library, made copies, and mailed them to me anonymously. But who and why? I was about to find out that Bryce had made more enemies than just me. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Check your email. There's more. I ran to my computer and found a message from a temporary email account with no identifying information. The message revealed that I wasn't his first target. He'd tried this same campaign against the elderly man who lived in my house before me. Mr. Garrett had a small dog, and Bryce had spent months trying to get it removed through false animal welfare concerns. Mr. Garrett had moved away rather than fight it, but he'd kept all the documentation. When this person saw Bryce doing the same thing to me, they'd contacted Mr. Garrett and gotten copies of everything. The message ended with an offer to meet the next morning at the Coffee Bean on Main Street to share the rest of the evidence. I stared at the screen in shock. This wasn't just about me and my dogs. This was Bryce's pattern. He'd successfully driven at least one person out of the neighborhood using the same tactics, and he was planning to do it again. But this time he'd picked the wrong target, and apparently I wasn't the only one who'd figured that out. The woman sitting across from me at Coffee Bean looked like a librarian crossed with a detective, mid-50s, sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a folder thick enough to fill a drawer. "I'm Carol Brennan," she said, extending her hand. "I work at the library, and I've been watching Bryce's activities for 6 months. You're the one who sent me the documents?" Among other things. She opened the folder and spread papers across our small table. "What I sent you was just the tip of the iceberg. The documents made my head spin. Printouts of emails, copies of forged petitions, photographs, and detailed logs of his visits to the library's computers. He's been using our public computers to avoid creating a digital trail on his home network," Carol explained. "But he didn't realize we keep usage logs and that some computers save documents temporarily." She showed me a timeline that made my situation look simple. Over the past 2 years, Bryce had targeted 6 different neighbors with harassment campaigns. Mr. Garrett and his dog were just the beginning. Mrs. Foster on Pine Street, he spread rumors she was running an illegal daycare because neighborhood kids liked playing in her yard. Carol pointed to a stack of documents. The Kowalski family on Oak, he reported them for suspicious activity because they received a lot of packages. Turns out the husband was battling cancer and getting medical supplies delivered. "How did you figure all this out?" "I started paying attention after Mr. Garrett came to me crying." Carol's voice hardened. "That sweet old man loved his little terrier more than anything in the world. When he moved away, he was heartbroken. He begged me to keep an eye out in case Bryce tried it again." She pulled out a photograph that made my stomach turn. It showed Bryce in the act of placing something in Mr. Garrett's yard while the elderly man was at a doctor's appointment. Same pattern every time. He creates false problems, builds fake cases, then presents himself as the reasonable neighborhood advocate trying to solve them. Carol leaned forward. "But you're the first person who fought back instead of just moving away. What do you want me to do with this?" "Expose him publicly in front of everyone he's manipulated." That afternoon, I sent an email to the neighborhood association requesting an emergency meeting. I claimed to have important information about recent community safety concerns that needed immediate attention. The president, a woman named Janet Pierce, agreed to schedule it for Saturday evening. I spent Friday night preparing my presentation. Security camera footage, veterinary records, the forged petition, Bryce's emails to the city, and Carol's documentation of his other victims. I organized everything to show exactly how he'd manufactured the case against me. But I also prepared for war. Bryce wasn't going to take this exposure quietly. Saturday evening, the community center was packed again. Word had spread about another neighborhood meeting, and people were curious about what new drama was unfolding. Bryce arrived early and positioned himself in the front row, looking confident and concerned. He nodded sympathetically at neighbors as they filed in, playing the role of the community advocate who'd reluctantly taken on a difficult situation. He had no idea what was coming. Janet called the meeting to order and turned the floor over to me. "I understand you have some important information to share with the community." I connected my laptop to the projector and faced the room full of neighbors who'd been convinced I was an animal abuser. 3 months ago, someone in this neighborhood decided to destroy my life, I began. "Tonight, you're going to find out who and why." The first slide showed a photo of Copper and Benny playing happily in our yard. "These are my dogs. Happy, healthy, well-cared-for animals who've never hurt anyone or caused any real problems." I clicked to the next slide. Officer Cooper's inspection report. "This is the official animal control assessment from this week. Quote, no evidence of neglect or abuse. Animals are clearly well cared for." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I saw Mrs. Patterson look confused and the Andersons exchange glances. "But someone can convinced many of you that I was abusing these animals. Tonight, you'll see exactly how that someone manufactured a completely false case. The next slide showed security camera footage of Bryce throwing the raggedy item into my yard. This is my neighbor Bryce Whitman planting evidence on Thursday morning, 3 hours before the animal control inspection. Watch carefully. The room went dead silent as they watched Bryce clearly and deliberately toss the unsafe item over my fence. You could hear a pin drop when the video showed him looking around to make sure no one was watching. That item had a piece of tape with my name on it, I continued. It was meant to look like I was providing unsafe items for my dogs. I looked directly at Bryce. His confident expression had turned to stone, but his hands were gripping the arms of his chair. The next slide showed his email to the City Planning Commission. This is Bryce's email requesting authority to establish himself as neighborhood animal control. Note where he refers to me as his primary target and admits to building a false case to establish precedent. Someone in the back row gasped. I heard Janet mutter something under her breath. But the most damning evidence is this. I clicked to the forged petition. Bryce submitted this to the city, claiming unanimous neighborhood support for his animal control program. The problem is, most of these signatures are fake. I zoomed in on sections where the handwriting was clearly identical across multiple names. Bryce forged signatures on this petition, including several people who aren't even residents of this neighborhood. The room erupted in angry voices. People were turning to look at Bryce and his face had gone completely pale. But wait, it gets worse. I clicked to Carol's timeline. This isn't the first time Bryce has done this. Over the past 2 years, he's targeted 6 different neighbors with similar harassment campaigns. I showed photos and documents from each case. Mrs. Foster, the Kowalski family, Mr. Garrett, all victims of Bryce's manufactured controversies. Mr. Garrett, the elderly man who lived in my house before me, was driven out of the neighborhood by the exact same tactics Bryce used on me. False reports, planted evidence, and a community convinced that this sweet old man was somehow a threat to his own dog. Mrs. Patterson stood up abruptly. This is outrageous. Bryce, is this true? All eyes turned to him. Bryce looked like a cornered animal. This is all taken out of context, he said, his voice shaky. I was trying to help the community address legitimate concerns. By forging signatures? Janet interrupted. By planting evidence? Those videos could be manipulated, Bryce said desperately. Technology these days. I clicked to another slide. The library computer logs showing every time Bryce had used public terminals to print documents and send emails. These are official library records showing exactly when you use their computers to avoid leaving digital trails on your home network. They match perfectly with all your harassment activities. Carol stood up from the back of the room. I can verify every one of those records. I've been documenting Mr. Whitman's activities for 6 months. Bryce's head snapped around to stare at Carol. You've been spying on me? I've been protecting this community from a manipulative predator, Carol replied calmly. The room exploded into chaos. People were shouting questions, demanding explanations, and arguing with each other. Janet banged her gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. Through it all, Bryce sat frozen in his chair, watching his carefully constructed authority crumble in real time. Everyone, please! Janet finally yelled. Let's hear what Mr. Whitman has to say in his own defense. Bryce stood up slowly, looking around the room at faces that had once trusted his judgment. The power dynamic had completely reversed. Now he was the one under scrutiny. I was trying to maintain neighborhood standards, he stammered. Sometimes that requires difficult decisions. Difficult decisions like framing innocent people? Someone called out. Like forging our signatures? Yelled another voice. Like driving an elderly man out of his home? Mrs. Patterson added, her voice shaking with anger. Bryce's composure finally cracked. You people have no idea how hard it is to maintain property values in this neighborhood. Do you want to live next to people who don't take care of their responsibilities? Do you want problem animals bringing down everyone's investment? Those dogs don't cause problems, the Andersons' father said. We live right next door and they're quieter than most. And there's nothing neglected about them, added Mrs. Chen. They're obviously loved and well cared for. You're all being manipulated, Bryce shouted, completely losing control. Can't you see that? One person shows you some documents and suddenly you forget months of legitimate concerns? Legitimate concerns? I stepped forward. You mean the concerns you manufactured? The evidence you planted? The signatures you forged? I did what needed to be done. Bryce was fully unhinged now. Sometimes the community needs strong leadership to address problems that weak people won't handle. The room went silent. In trying to defend himself, Bryce had just admitted to everything. Janet looked stunned. Mr. Whitman, are you confessing to filing false reports and forging signatures? Bryce seemed to realize what he'd just said. He looked around the room desperately, but every face showed disgust or anger. This meeting is over, he said, grabbing his jacket. You'll all regret this when property values start dropping. He stormed toward the exit, but Mrs. Patterson's voice stopped him. Bryce Whitman, you should be ashamed of yourself. That poor Mr. Garrett trusted you, and you destroyed his life for no reason except your own ego. Bryce turned back, his face twisted with rage. Mr. Garrett was weak. His dog was a nuisance. This neighborhood is better off without people like him. People like him? Carol stood up again. You mean people who mind their own business and don't try to control their neighbors' lives? I mean people who don't understand what it takes to maintain standards, Bryce shouted. And with that final outburst, he stormed out of the community center, leaving behind a room full of neighbors who finally understood exactly who he really was. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Janet cleared her throat. I think we owe our neighbor an apology, she said, looking at me. And we need to discuss what actions to take regarding Mr. Whitman's behavior. The apology started immediately. Mrs. Patterson was the first to approach me after Janet adjourned the meeting. Tears in her eyes, she grabbed my hands and wouldn't let go. I am so sorry, she said. I should have trusted my own judgment instead of listening to gossip. Copper and Benny are wonderful dogs, and you're a wonderful owner. The Andersons were next with their kids in tow. Their youngest daughter hugged my legs and asked if she could still play with the fluffy boys through the fence. Of course you can, I told her. They've missed you. One by one, neighbors approached to apologize and share their own concerns about Bryce's behavior. Several admitted they'd felt uncomfortable with his pushiness, but hadn't known how to address it. He always made it sound like he was doing the right thing, said Mr. Chen, but something felt off about how he went about it. By the end of the evening, I had invitations invitations to 3 barbecues, offers to help with dog walking, and promises that this kind of manipulation would never happen again in our neighborhood. But the real consequences for Bryce were just beginning. The next morning, Carol called to tell me she'd forwarded all her evidence to the police and the district attorney's office. Filing false police reports is a crime, she explained. So is forgery and harassment. The DA is very interested in the pattern of behavior you helped expose. 2 days later, Bryce received a visit from detectives. I watched from my kitchen window as they spent an hour at his house, taking photos and loading boxes of documents into their car. That afternoon, Janet called to inform me that the neighborhood association was pursuing a restraining order against Bryce and considering legal action for the forged petition. We also voted to establish new policies about harassment and false accusations, she said. No one wants to see this happen to anyone else. The City Planning Commission sent Bryce a formal letter revoking his application for Neighborhood Watch Authority and warning him about submitting fraudulent documents to government offices. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence was the social isolation. Within a week, Bryce's house became the one everyone avoided. No one waved when he checked his mail. No one included him in neighborhood activities. The power and influence he'd worked so hard to build evaporated overnight. Mrs. Patterson later told me she'd seen him outside one evening, trying to start a conversation with a neighbor walking their dog. The neighbor had simply turned around and walked the other way. He looked so confused, she said, like he couldn't understand why no one wanted to talk to him anymore. 3 weeks after the confrontation, I found out what happened to Mr. Garrett. Carol had tracked down his new address and sent him copies of everything we'd uncovered. He called me the next day, crying with relief. I knew I wasn't crazy, he said through tears. I knew my little buddy wasn't a problem dog. But when everyone starts believing the same story about you, you begin to doubt yourself. Mr. Garrett had moved to a senior living community 2 hours away, where pets were welcome and he'd made new friends who appreciated both him and Buddy. I'm happier now, he assured me, but I'm so grateful you fought back. Maybe now other people won't go through what we did. That conversation made me realize something important. This hadn't just been about me and my dogs. It had been about standing up to bullying disguised as community service. A month after the exposure, Bryce put his house up for sale. I watched through my front window as the realtor's sign went up on his immaculate lawn. Part of me felt vindicated. Another part felt sad that it had come to this. But mostly I felt relieved. The harassment campaigns stopped completely. The anonymous notes disappeared. No more manufactured crises or fake evidence. The neighborhood settled back into the peaceful routine I'd originally fallen in love with. Copper and Benny became neighborhood celebrities in the best possible way. Kids lined up to pet them during our evening walks. Other dog owners started organizing playdate meetups in the local park. Mrs. Patterson resumed her daily visits, always carrying treats and staying for those long conversations I'd missed. The security camera I'd installed to catch Bryce's harassment became a source of entertainment. I started sharing funny footage of the dogs playing, Copper's dramatic reactions to squirrels, Benny's attempts to catch his own tail, both of them losing their minds with excitement whenever the mail truck arrived. Look at these vicious, abused animals, Mrs. Chen joked one day as we watched Benny roll around in my sprinkler, clearly having the time of his life. 6 months later, I got a call from Carol with an update. Bryce had pleaded guilty to filing false police reports and harassment charges. He received probation, community service, and a permanent restraining order, preventing him from contacting me or any of his other victims. The DA said your evidence was crucial, Carol told me. Without the security footage and those documents, it would have been much harder to prove the pattern of behavior. More importantly, Carol had been working with Mr. Garrett and the other victims to establish a support network for people dealing with neighborhood harassment. We're calling it the Community Truth Project, she explained. People can report suspicious patterns of complaints or manipulation campaigns before they escalate. The initiative had already helped 2 other neighborhoods identify and stop similar harassment schemes. As I write this, it's been a year since that nightmare began. My relationship with most neighbors is stronger than it was before the crisis. We've all learned to be more skeptical of manufactured outrage and more protective of each other's well-being. Copper and Benny are still the happiest dogs on the block. They have no idea they were ever at the center of a neighborhood controversy. To them, every day is just another opportunity to play, explore, and receive attention from their many human friends. The new family that moved into Bryce's old house has 2 cats and a vegetable garden. Their kids love playing with my dogs, and we've already started planning joint birthday parties for pets and children. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I hadn't fought back. If I'd been like Mr. Garrett and just moved away to avoid the conflict. Bryce would still be targeting innocent neighbors, manufacturing crises, and positioning himself as the neighborhood authority. Other people would have lost their homes, their pets, or their peace of mind to feed one man's need for control. But I also think about the lesson I learned about community manipulation. How easy it is to weaponize people's good intentions. How quickly rumors can destroy trust that took years to build. How someone with enough confidence and persistence can convince rational people to believe almost anything. The experience taught me to trust my own judgment even when everyone else seems to disagree. To look for patterns instead of isolated incidents. To ask for evidence before accepting serious accusations. And to remember that the loudest voice in the room isn't always the most trustworthy. Most importantly, it taught me that fighting back against bullying, even sophisticated community-wide bullying, is worth the effort. Not just for yourself, but for everyone else who might become a target. Every evening when I take Copper and Benny for their walk around the neighborhood, I see the life we've all built together. Kids playing in yards, neighbors chatting over fences, dogs running freely in the park. The community Bryce tried to control through fear and manipulation has become something better. A place where people look out for each other without trying to control each other. And when I see new families moving into the neighborhood, I make sure to welcome them properly. To let them know they're entering a community that values kindness over control, truth over rumors, and support over suspicion. Because everyone deserves to feel safe and welcome in their own neighborhood, even their dogs.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and drop your favorite part in the comments. See you in the next one.